Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nisha Gee. I am the Manager of Advocacy, Mobilization, and Engagement at Independent Sector. Welcome to our February advocacy webinar entitled The Civil Rights Movement and the Future of Racial Equity and Policy. The topic for today's webinar discusses how we live in a history-driven present. Therefore, it is particularly important to begin with acknowledging the land upon which nonprofits work to build vibrant communities. Today, I am joining from Alexandria, Virginia, the ancestral home of one of the largest slave trading operations in the country. It's often said that Black history did not begin with slavery. While that may be true, the American experience for people of color did. More than 1.5 centuries since slavery's abolition, America has yet to fully reckon with how to make amends for its original sin. From the time of emancipation, Black Americans have sought to attain economic and social mobility, and despite significant reforms in policy, have struggled to keep pace with their white counterparts. More than 60 years after the Civil Rights Movement, America has yet to honor its declaration that all men are created equal and has defaulted on its promise to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The disparities that can be observed in communities of color today can be traced back to public policies, both implicit and explicit, from the time of slavery to Jim Crow, from redlining to school segregation, from the war on drugs that resulted in mass incarceration, and to environmental racism that has plagued communities of color nationwide. Each of these policies, though well-intended at the time of implementation, have significantly reduced the quality and longevity of Black and Brown lives. I'm going to pivot over to our President and CEO, Dan, who's going to introduce our keynote speakers for today.
Thank you, Nisha. And I'd like to welcome all those who are joining us from all over the country. And particularly, I'd like to welcome our wonderful speakers and moderator. So joining us today are Atlanta City Council member Michael Julian Bond, son of Julian Bond, Andrea Young, Executive Director of ACLU of Georgia and daughter of Andrew Young, and Lauren Young Casteel, President and CEO of the Women's Foundation of Colorado and daughter of Whitney Young, and Jeremie Greer, who holds many hats, and I'll have him introduce himself before he starts as a moderator, but I'm happy to say has been a Independent Sector Policy Fellow and co-conspirator. And before we jump into this, I just want to acknowledge that we at Independent Sector are cognizant of two very important dynamics. The first is that the nonprofit sector has in many regards over the course of our long history as a nation been two things at the same time: an engine of social and environmental reform, where the values of individual human flourishing and collective human flourishing have been driven forward into public policies and the norms and culture. And at the same time, we have been complicit with the racial caste system that has often built our nation. We're at a moment in our nation of real reflection. The pandemic, the multiple murders this year that really came for the American public, and the economic impact have really put in high relief the continued racism that has structured our nation. And it's a clarion call to the sector once again to take up its work, to both be reflective of how it is complicit in these structures and how it can also be an engine of transformation. And so today's webinar really has an extraordinary opportunity to hear from leaders who were birthed into families that were integral to driving the civil rights movement 60 years ago today, and have dedicated their lives to carrying that work forward. And it is their wisdom and guidance that we hope to listen to today and learn from, and to then follow how we then have to confront our own internal work as organizations and our clarion call to kind of external work to build policies that really drive equity across the country. So to kick ourselves off on this, I'd like to just ask our participants to fill out a poll that will help our moderator, Jeremie, kind of tee things up. So we're going to put up, Nisha's going to put up a poll question now. And it is, which of the following policies is your organization's greatest impediment to achieving racial equity? Which of the following practices is your organization's greatest impediment to achieving racial equity? So I'm going to give folks a little bit of a moment here, and then we'll look at the results. Nisha, how are we doing? Got
We'll give participants another 30 seconds or so to finalize their answers before revealing the results.
super, thank you. And just as a reminder to participants, please know that we're interested in your engagement. There'll be plenty of opportunity at the end. So please put your questions in the Q&A section, if possible, so that we can track those and tee them up for Jeremie. Okay, looks like the poll is down and the results are about 51% said organizations' capacity, whether it be inadequate staffing, lack of resources, insufficient funds, support for governance or leadership as the key limiting factor around driving racial equity. Next is identifying effective frameworks and methods, so capacity building and training. Third is understanding how racial equity intersects with your mission. So really kind of hardcore work around the relationship between your current mission and racial equity. Third would be D, collecting and applying disaggregated data to inform policies and practices. And last, other, and we'll see in the chat what those are. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeremie Greer, both friend of independent sector. Ask him to talk a little bit just briefly about his current work and then jump into this session. Thanks, Jeremie.
Great, thanks, Dan. And as Dan mentioned, I am honored to have been a public policy fellow, but also a next gen fellow with independent sector. It's been a really great partnership for myself and for all the organizations that I've worked with. So I'll talk a bit about myself, and then we're going to just dive into this conversation that I'm so excited to be a part of with these incredible leaders that independent sectors brought together today. But I'm with Liberation in a Generation. We're a startup organization that launched to really be a support to movement groups to do two things: fight for economic and racial justice, and to do so by really looking at what are the public policies, what are the changes that we can make in our system, in our economic systems, to bring liberation to people of color within one generation. And why I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation is that we really see ourselves as being an extension of the movement that the civil rights movement that has really got us to where we are today, and the unfinished work that was really led by people during that time. There's a quote from Dr. King that we think about a lot in our work, and it goes like this: it's easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee a livable income and a solid job. And for us who work on economic justice, that's something that we really hold, that a lot of what the movement was about creating that economic opportunity and creating economic justice for Black people and all people in this country. So with that, I'm just gonna dive in. I have a few questions. Again, if you have questions, put them in the, I believe you can put them in the chat, or you can put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end. But I want to start off, and maybe if Lauren, if you could start us off with this question. And it's really about trying to learn from what we can learn from that time in the civil rights era. There's for me, it was like, in my recollection, the last time we've had big kind of earth-shaking systemic change for racial justice, passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act. And I want, and I'm someone, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. So like, what lessons can we learn from that time to apply to the kind of incredible and hard work that we're doing today around these issues?
Thank you very much for the question, Jeremie, and welcome to all of you who are watching us here today. First and foremost, I want to be clear that I had the pleasure of the accident of birth into my family and therefore a front row seat into the civil rights movement. But I don't think that gives me any special expertise in any way, shape, or form through that accident of birth, although I have dedicated my life to this work as well. I would say to you, Jeremie, a couple of things. One, when you say that was sort of like the big moment, if we go back to slavery, the Middle Passage, rebellions that existed en route to America, much less the Underground Railroad, then what we didn't have was television. We didn't have all of the communication tools that brought to life, much less the cell phones that illustrate the murder of George Floyd. So those things mean that we are now brought into our homes and into our consciousness of everyone in America, a different level of awareness of these inequities and injustices that exist within our society. When I think back to lessons, and my father, I was only 17 when my father drowned off the coast of Nigeria. So as I said to Andrea and Michael, for me, it has not all been firsthand of watching my father's leadership. He was only 49 when he died as well. But what I did observe and what I do know, and these are lessons that can be carried forward, was that every one of the leaders within the context of the civil rights movement held a piece of the truth. And they each brought forward into the movement a variety of voices and constituents, and that those constituents represented a full range of the Black experience in America. That was one of the things that my father, I know, brought forward to me that I remember very clearly, which was to be sure that I could distinguish between symbols and substance. So I had an enormous afro. Andrea might remember it. She and I went to undergrad school together. And as I was growing up, I would slap free Angela stickers on the refrigerator door. And he'd say, that's great, but what I care about is not just what's on your head, it's what's in your head. It's not what's on the refrigerator door, it's the food that people have in their refrigerators in their homes. So even though the leaders, and I think we would all agree, did not always agree at all times on every strategy at every moment, and there were at times divisions that occurred. My father and Martin split over the war, the Vietnam War. My father felt that we should remain focused on civil rights and not on the movement for peace. But when they were behind closed doors, there may have been struggles, but they always came out with a sense of clarity of the purpose and the long goal for the long haul. So if we can recognize that whether Martin was bringing the faith community or students through SNCC, the sleeping car porters through A. Philip Randolph, that all of those people who spoke on the steps for the March for Jobs and Freedom were in fact representing the whole broad swathe of our people onto the forefront. And as they looked out from those steps as well, what they saw was the broad swathe of America. So today we have to redefine what it means to be an ally. We also have to ask ourselves whether marching is a symbol or whether it's a substance. As my father said during the March on Washington, we need to march to the voter registration booth. That was a beginning. It was not an end at that time, thus relating to the issue of public policy.
Great. Thank you for that. Michael, I wonder, could you reflect on this question around lessons from that time that we could apply as we move into this work today?
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and greetings to my co-panelists and those who are tuned in. I think some of the lessons that we really need to take away from the 60s and 70s of the civil rights movement is that it's not over, and that it is a slow march towards freedom and attaining equality, and the elimination of poverty. This is ongoing work. It doesn't end. It might evolve, it changes, but it doesn't end. And one of the things I like to say is that, in the example of elections, we often in politics are conditioned to try to get people out when it's a so-called, big race, or a big election. But we have to look at it more like innings in baseball, that, you take a turn at bat, but there's always another inning to be played, and you have to build in that expectation into the community that, we're not going to get the big victory or have the big march or listen to someone give a big speech and then our problems are going to be gone. We have to condition our community, those that we're working in concert with, that this is going to be, we're in it for the long haul. And we have to have that expectation of not going to be, one of the things when you look at vintage films, barging, for example, one of the great things is having that.
Seems like the council is having trouble with his internet connection. Andrea, I wonder, could you
jump in?
could you reflect on the same question and also introduce yourself to the
Sure. Yeah, I'm Andrea Young. I'm the executive director of the ACLU of Georgia. Really pleased to be a part of this. All of my career, I guess one of the effects of being brought up in the civil rights movement is that my whole career has been either in the government or mostly in the nonprofits sector. So very pleased to be a part of this conversation. I think that, what I saw this past year, and I think we've not had enough chance to reflect on it, is I think we did see young people who absolutely understand the lessons of the 60s and 70s and previous iterations of the movement, Black liberation struggle. We saw nonviolent activism. We saw people in the streets. We saw multicultural coalitions. We saw people with policy agendas. Unlike, I thought one of the big lost opportunities of the Occupy is like, okay, what do you guys want? It's like, do you want a $15 minimum wage? Do you want, give us what's an ask, right? So, the leaders of Black Lives Matter movement this year, they had specific policy agendas that they wanted. And what we saw in Georgia is that they took all of that energy into the voting booths. And so we elected, the story that hasn't come out of Georgia yet, you all, we sent you two brilliant senators. But what the story you haven't heard is all of the elected officials who have an agenda to reform the criminal justice system. Our motto was kind of hope, vote, advocate. And so we're now in that era of advocating, because it doesn't matter, when my dad became mayor of Atlanta, some of his friends immediately picketed him the next day, right? And so we have to employ all the tools at our disposal in order to affect the change that we want to see. And, we need to do, we can always do it in a, we don't have to be disagreeable about it. We can disagree without being disagreeable. We can understand that all the tactics are necessary. You need people in the suites, you need people in the legislature, and Michael knows some of, we can drink margaritas one day, and then we will be lobbying his office the next. And so, we now have Black leaders like Michael who are, they are leaders in the government. They are people, they are, as we sometimes used to say, if you in Pharaoh's job, we're going to pressure you like Pharaoh. We know that you are there because, you understand, you're steeped in this tradition, but everybody has their part to play in a democratic society. So I think the young people totally get it. I think one of the takeaways from, today there are hearings on the tragedy at the Capitol. And I think one of the reasons I've always said to my staff is that that's how you tell the good, violence is how you tell the good guys from the bad guys. So our movements are nonviolent, and they have to continue to be nonviolent, because that is how you tell the good guys, the people who want democratic change, social change that it benefits, the vast majority of Americans, and the people who are anti-democratic, who are authoritarian, and who are trying to tear down our system. And so as flawed as it is, our democratic system gives us tools for, as we say in the ACLU, to create a more perfect union. So I think if there's any takeaway from what happened, from the success of the demonstrations over the last year, is that, like the civil rights movement, the nonviolent social activism was effective and will continue to be effective. And we need all of the tools for social change that people have learned to employ. We need the protest. We need, the demonstrations toward a policy goal. We need the voting. We need good people to run for office. And then, we need the techniques that hold people accountable once they run for office. So I think people have gotten it, and we just have to continue working this formula, because it has brought about the only sustainable change that we've seen.
Thanks. And Andrea, this question is gonna be for all of you, but I want you to start off because you're a nonprofit leader. You're running a nonprofit, you have employees, you have an institution you're trying to run. And I think this year like elevated for people with like the disparities for Black and brown people getting sick from COVID and dying, or lots of essential workers are Black and brown. And then that you referenced them, the uprisings of the summer after the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and so many others before. And it's brought a consciousness, like a public consciousness, around this conversation around racial justice. And we know that, and those of us who've been in it for a little bit know that kind of ebbs and flows, right? There's moments when it's on everyone's mind, and then there's moments when it goes away. And I wonder if you could reflect on, and then think about some ways and some stuff that people could take away with around how to integrate this issue of like fighting for racial justice into your kind of day-to-day work, so that when the public consciousness kind of goes down, we're still staying on mission to accomplish those things. And just even if like some real tactical things people could do to kind of keep that going. Well,
I think so. Today is the anniversary of Ahmaud Arbery's killing, and so we certainly want to reflect on that and the movement in Georgia that inspired and sustained. We, I think as a nonprofit leader, and even as a Black woman with roots in going back to I was looking at, after 1619 Project came out, I looked back at my family tree and counted 5 generations of our family lived in American slavery before the Civil War ended. So, sort of steeped in that history, that you know, we still can always learn. One of the things that happened when Lauren and I were at Swarthmore is that we had to fight just to get a Black professor tenure, Black history professor. And so now we also, there's so much more that we know today because of the civil rights movement about Black history. And one of the things I want to challenge about the opening is that Black people have not struggled to keep pace. When we catch up, we get knocked down, right? When we catch up or start passing by, you know, Tulsa gets burned, right? You know, so I mean, it has taken the kind of violence that people saw at the Capitol to keep Black people at a disadvantage in this country. It's been a sustained effort that included quite a lot of violence and other means. But I think one of the things we have to do is we have to own that that the sort of racial discrimination is like in the atmosphere. That I thought that it was actually one of my white donors that was like obsessed with Ibram Kendi and had me reading the how to be an anti-racist, and I'm like, oh yeah, no, that's fine. But I mean, I think it's very, very powerful. And of course, the reason he could write How to Be an Anti-Racist is that he first had written, stamped from the beginning, the history of racist ideas going all the way back to the 1600s. So the scholarship that was possible for him is a result of the work of the civil rights movement and then those of us who took it in academia. So I think one is, you know, study, I mean, know the truth about the history. Understand the reality. Take your staff. If you can't do it, we took all of the Southern ACLU staff to Montgomery to see the memorial, right? Understand the violence that has permeated America, and then and so that you understand that every way that you think, you have to consciously be working to not be racist, because everything about the traditional practices and assumptions, you know, the assumptions that the MAGA people wouldn't be violent, even though the last two times they were in Washington, D.C., weapons were confiscated from them and they were violent. And so this sort of myth of Black guilt, the other side of it is the myth of white innocence. And there's so many themes that are so persistent in that when you start, I think once you have seen it, I think it's hard to stop seeing it. But we've got to stop the denial. The other thing I would say is that if you look at, to understand how pervasive, you know, the effect of racism is, the structural racism is, if you want to understand structural racism in America, just look at the coronavirus. You know, look at who died, you know, and then look at the early responses. Oh, well, Black people are dying because they don't wash their hands. No, Black people are dying because they're the ones in the grocery store where you refuse to wear a mask. And so, you know, and now we're saying, oh, we're going to distribute the vaccine through CVS. And we're saying, no, we don't have CVS. And the parts of the Black community that are the worst hit doesn't have a grocery store, doesn't have a CVS, doesn't have these franchises. Maybe there's a Wingstop, you know, but, you know, so we've got to, I mean, it's all been revealed. And so I think the other thing is to say, you know, no more can anyone say they don't understand. Right. It's all been laid out. It's all, you know, it is very, very clear. And so I think we just have to embrace that and really make a decision to study it. The ACLU is got, you know, nationwide EDIB, really, really focusing, doing, you know, just persistent, as you said, put it in your budget that you do this training, put it in your budget that you talk about these topics, because, you know, as Jesus said, where your money is, there your heart lies also. So, you know, let's show, I mean, you know, put your money where your mouth is. And, you know, we do have to institutionalize these things and understand that it is a lifelong process, because the ether, I mean, it's just, racism is oxygen. You know, you have to, it is just pervasive. It's everywhere. I mean, it's not the oxygen, but it's everywhere that we are in the atmosphere that we breathe. So, you know, maybe it's the ozone, but it's, and so we have to, this is a moment to acknowledge that. And as you said, just start to put in place institutional practices like EDIB programs, your budget, reviewing board selection practices, what kind of board does your board have an EDIB committee? Are you looking, I think the Management Center has excellent resources about checking yourself. Does this job require a college degree? When you're doing hiring, are you giving people credit for the skills that they have in the real world? What's your equity, your pay equity look like? So and always given that screen of, am I promoting an anti-racist policy, or am I perpetuating the status quo, which then is perpetuating racist policies and practices?
Yeah, Lauren, I wonder if could we bring you in on this question?
Sure.
Do you have any reflections?
Happy, absolutely. I run an organization that is a 501c3, and although we are also a funder, we're a community foundation that is focused on women and their families throughout the state of Colorado. So we are a nonprofit, a fundraising organization, just like everybody else. I fully support what Andrea has said about investing in the work itself. We have been going through a process called Awake to Woke to Work. It's a really interesting sort of roadmap that we embarked on some years ago. But in the context of that work of looking at staff, certainly board composition, hiring practices, I happen to have been one of those kids who, when I started in my career, did not have a college degree. I did not graduate from Swarthmore. And no one knew anything about my family. I'd moved to Colorado. Someone took a chance on me for reasons that to this day I don't fully understand, other than it was a brown woman who saw something in me that she had seen in herself. So I didn't meet all the criteria. I was someone whose potential was poised to be lost. So I want to emphasize that part as well. It's also thinking about our investments. Our investment committee has had a gender lens investment 100% for our donor advised funds for a number of years. And similarly, over close to 60% of our unitized pool in our portfolio. But then we went further and added an additional goal of 25% by 2025. That would be managers who are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian managers and their intersections thereof. And that 10% explicitly would be not just women and minority. I happen to think we're the new emerging majority, but that they are management firms of our portfolio. The realm of bias, until we create that demand within the arena of investments, the realm of bias that exists, that we can't manage money somehow, we don't know how. You can't give people cash assistance unless you teach them how to handle, financial management 101. Well, folks know if they need food or housing or whatever that particular instance may be. There's also an interesting document that's about 15 or maybe even 20 years old that defines white supremacy culture. And white supremacy culture is not just about tiki torches. It's about having values within one's organization where, unless it's in a memo, then it doesn't exist. Or where we elevate to certain levels of credibility and decision-making, certain perspectives in some way, simply because historically that's the way it's been done. So coming to a place of intentional disruption of that, the word disruption can make people anxious, but simply to say that we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to ask ourselves as a nonprofit, whether the people that we seek to support have voice on our decision-making committees, whether we have lived experience, not just diversity, equity, and inclusion, but as Andrew was saying, adding the B, the belonging. If you think about John Powell, sometimes you can have universal goals, and he's the guru of targeted universalism, and certainly of belonging as well. But it's about that intentionality, and then you have to measure it. You have to hold people accountable. When you do staff reviews with your managers, you have to ask them, did you uphold this value? What did that look like? Where did you perhaps have a misstep? Because you can't just count the numbers. What lessons did you learn, perhaps, from something that felt profoundly uncomfortable? The nonprofit sector, all of the organizations in the civil rights movement, for the most part, were nonprofits. Even though people, among our, as mayor or legislator moved into that political structure, but they began in churches that are nonprofits and nonprofit organizations. We have the opportunity to be absolutely unequivocally on the cutting edge of learning and keeping our eyes on the prize. But you have to invest, and you have to hold yourselves accountable for the work, and you have to understand that it makes you better. All of the evidence points to that. Our missions are better served when we do the work of social justice and equity. The last thing that I would say is that I don't know that I struggle with original sin, because you can be forgiven for sin. Some things should not be forgiven. And when we think about what happened to our Native American and Indigenous communities, and the tribes, when culture was imposed upon them. And I also hope we can talk about intersections and the role of women in these movements then and now and for the future. Women are, in fact, the keepers of the culture in many ways. So I hope that the hand washing that we talk about, if you don't have running water in Navajo reservations, how do you answer that?
Thank you. I love that. No, this isn't sin. Some sins should not be forgiven. Absolutely. That's right. Michael, you kind of were fixing your internet connection. So I'll restate the question just so that you kind of, so you feel like you can respond. The question was really around this focus on racial equity kind of ebbs and flows based upon, and we're in that place where there's a lot of visibility for it. And just wanted to get your sense of like, how do you integrate racial justice into your work in a way so that when there isn't a lot of attention on it, you're still staying on mission and really focusing on that work?
Well, there's an old saying in politics called the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so those who cry out, those who are making their issues known, often are the ones who are getting their issues addressed. One of the things I think is important is that it's got to be intentional and ongoing, as I was attempting to say earlier. We have to say, the state of affairs in America, as far as race and equity, is not what it should be. And so we need to work tirelessly, relentlessly, purposely until it is. One of the things is that it has to be also addressed at every level. It's not enough to do it at your local township or county or city. It's got to go to the state level and ultimately, of course, to the federal level. So in working in partnerships with nonprofits who are in that vein, who are in that space, and doing it deliberately and making sure that not only are we doing it in our public platforms, but when we're together in our groups, in our social settings, in our planning meetings, that we're observing the same standards. Those affected minorities who suffer from the efforts, the existence of racism and prejudice, don't need lessons in racism and prejudice. It is those who don't and who are not exposed on a daily basis. And that's probably the majority of the country. And so there's a constant need for education. There's a constant need to bring the issues to the fore, to educate those who are not impacted. It might have been Andrea that said earlier about not having our forebearers didn't have the opportunity for television, internet, cell phones, et cetera, to have an instant message about the trouble that's going on in Minneapolis or what's going on in Los Angeles. But we have those opportunities today to expose people, to create that ongoing awareness that something is not right in Denmark. Something's not right in our community when all of us can enjoy the fruits of what this nation promises. And so that can be inconvenient for people. That can be inconvenient for individuals, but it's got to be not only a collective mission in partnerships with government, nonprofits that can advocate in ways that government has to be restrained in some quarters, but it's also got to take place in our everyday conversations with the people we know, the people that we work with. What is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And the fact of the matter remains, even though there has tremendous progress made in the country since the 1960s, many of the goals of the SCLC, SNCC, NAACP, et cetera, have been attained. But as you point, it is a ebb and flow as to what people are interested in and what's going to catch their attention and what issues people are going to want to seek to address. But we're still in a state of emergency in America when it comes to the situation. We're still, we weren't legally free as African Americans technically until 1965. And when you say that to people, they're astonished. I was born in 66. So, I'm literally the first year of a generation that's actually legally, completely, technically born free in America from African Americans. And so, of course, we received our freedom, back in 1865, so-called. But then, we've had this ongoing effort, as has been mentioned, to kind of beat that back. They want to beat this community, these minorities, the indigenous people in this country. If you're non-white, there's a concerted effort to keep you in the corner, to keep you in the background. And that's something that's got to be broken. And the only way to break it, if we want a perfect society, then we need to envision it like a diamond in the rough. No one cut on a diamond brings out its brilliance. It's got to be turned and cut over and over again. And so it's going to take all hands on deck, all efforts in all quarters to make a difference.
Jeremie,
Yeah.
forgive me, I'm just thinking, I saw in the question about intersectionality and also all journeys and all corners. I'm thinking about what Michael has just said. And I think that it's really essential when it comes to history for us to also recognize that the Pride movement was started by two transgender women of color. Black Lives Matter movement, women, queer women, Black women, and as the Me Too movement, Tarana Burke, Black woman. And that is not in any way to compete with my brothers, my fathers, my sons, my grandsons. But over the years, the inability to celebrate the role of women of color and Black women in particular as movement makers, when we tell the story of the civil rights movement and the story of the Big Six, Dorothy Height is often left out among dozens of other names. And as we go back, we don't want to get caught up in the oppression Olympics. I heard Alicia Garza once say that the oppression Olympics in and of themselves are oppressive. And so the question is, how do we commit to social justice, recognizing the various histories that we have, but also how oppression is oppression is oppression. And the death of transgender people within this country, for example, is another people about whom we need to care. So I think that the effectiveness of the future of the movement will be our ability to go from that mosaic that we saw on the streets, marching on the streets, of people, of the young people who were starting to get it and to move forward. and really help them to have the tools that we've talked about that are needed to run for office, to fund them, to use liberatory leadership, to give nonprofits as funders. Are we willing to give unrestricted dollars from a place of trust for multiple years to our nonprofit leaders? So those who are listening, who are funders as well, I urge you to consider that, as well as our vendors, all aspects of our strategic work, our operational work. But first and foremost, we have to support the intersections of our leadership.
Thank you for bringing that in. It's so critical and so important. And it's actually a point of emphasis I want you all to take in this last question. So, I want to give folks some tips around, some ideas, some tips away how to make this happen through public policy. And, Andrea mentioned, it was Black women who were carrying the ball in Georgia and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. And then what we saw was, and again, that to use, I think, your language, when we move forward, they knock us back, a whole movement of white power to try to take those votes away, like right after the.
Oh, at this very moment in Georgia,
Right.
they're doing that under the Gold Dome.
Yeah, and so I wonder if you could talk about, and then also give people some tips and some pointers around how they can do it, of how important, if you're doing the work of racial justice, how important public policy making is to that process, even if you're not maybe a public policy organization.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately it's policies that change practice, right? I mean, we had a Civil Rights Act, of 1964, public accommodation, 65 Voting Rights Act. I mean, that happened for a reason. I mean, the marching had been going on since Montgomery. What we find, so for in the voting rights space, say without pre-clearance, without the legislation of the Civil Rights Act, we, instead of being able to file an administrative action when, there are literally 40 bills right now in the Georgia legislature to make it more difficult for people to vote. If we get pre-clearance, if we get, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act out of the Congress, then we would have an administrative remedy, write a memo to the Justice Department, make our case that this has a disproportionate impact on Black voters. It's done. When we have to go litigate through the courts, it takes 3 to 5 years to finally get a resolution. And of course, tremendous resources that have to be raised from donors in order to do that. And Georgia by itself has 159 counties and I don't know how many other jurisdictions. So policy can change that reality. Policy, there's, one of the discussions about policy, whether or not Biden should forgive $10,000 in loans, $50,000 in loans. The ACLU's analysis says there will be no racial justice impact if he does 10,000. So he will forgive money and that'll be good for everybody. But the burden, the disproportionate burden on Black students who borrow more money to go to school, get charged a higher rate for the money they do borrow, get paid less for the job that they get when they graduate. So they're discriminated against 3 times. That's before you get to the fact that their parents' house has less of a value on it. I mean, just in that very tiny transaction. And so if you were to forgive 50,000, it would have a tremendous race equity impact by our analysis. And so these policy decisions, earned income tax credit, the most impactful thing that was done in the Clinton administration was the earned income tax credit. Now that you have single moms in the Congress, they're saying, okay, why do you get a bigger credit if you have a 2-parent household than if you have a 1-parent household? So, we now have people in the Congress who can ask who, because of their lived experience, who can ask questions no one's ever asked before about how these policies translate on the ground floor. I think it's no mistake that the Black woman that was involved in the Moderna vaccine, so it does not require deep freeze refrigeration to transport it, because she probably said early on, well, that's a non-starter. You can't get that vaccine out to, you know, poor neighborhoods if you've got to have freezers more expensive than the vaccine to transport it. So people's lived experience and how you make decisions about policy. We're still doing drive-through testing. We're still doing drive-through vaccination. Well, what about the people who don't have cars? Policy and all of the decisions that get made along the way are the way we get there. You know, how many times a year do you have to renegotiate your re-qualify for food stamps? Those of you all who don't live in the South may not realize that poor people without internet connections have to re-up for their food stamps and their Medicaid and their S-chip, every quarter. They use administrative things to keep people out of even the programs that do exist. You can't get on, just like you can't get online to get your grandparents a vaccination, you can't keep your health insurance, you can't keep the programs that you do qualify for. So the digital divide, we're setting up and we're going into this era where we have we've got to get very, very serious about questioning race equity and gender equity in every single thing that we do. Because if we aren't answering the question, this will improve race equity, we will not do it. It will not happen because the system is designed to perpetuate the racial disparities that we see today.
Jeremie, Michael, we'll give you a chance, and then we're going to go to audience questions after your response.
I think one of the things that the pandemic has done is it has ripped the veil off of the role that people of color play in our society. On the front lines, those who have been most vulnerable, and also those who have lost jobs. And that's impact on our economy. So both of those things are true. Front lines of healthcare, in vulnerable position, and losing jobs in retail, transportation, hospitality, manufacturing across the board. I think that we have to recognize that racial equity and racism, in fact, are detrimental to all of us. And that is just now, I think that's a glimmer of what is coming through in these times. And it's detrimental to our democracy as well. I also, when you talk about public policy and nonprofits, oftentimes people don't realize organizations who are C3s don't think that they can use public policy strategies. We're a C3, we're a community foundation, unlike private foundations. We can advocate, and we happen to have a lobbyist. We do an H filing. If you're not familiar with that, then I suggest that the nonprofits take a look at that. We choose those that we actively lobby on, usually 3 bills a year, and then we have passive support for others. And it is an essential tool. So when we talk about equal pay for equal work in Colorado, when we talk about paid family leave, when we talk about paid sick leave, earned income tax credits, we are at the table for each and every one of those. We will testify, and we have advocacy trainings for statewide. Zoom has actually been our friend. We can do statewide trainings on how to advocate. In these times, when we think about technology divides and the pain that parents are going through trying to educate kids while they're working at home with inadequate internet access or technology, is brutal. The number of children who will fall behind, as well as the women dropping out of the workforce itself, if in fact they happen to be oftentimes in a 2-income family. Policy is all about it. The debt relief, the relief package that is coming through is critical, but the federal government is not the only place. And we have to remember what happens in our legislatures as well, or in the mayor's office, or at the school board are equally as important. So the next thing is to support organizations that are training young people to run for office, training diverse intersections of people with lived experience, giving them the confidence that they have the credibility to be able to do that. So I put into the chat, and at least I sent it directly to independent sector. Boulder Advocacy will share some of the rules that exist for C3s. Andrea, I assume you guys are probably a C4, but that doesn't mean you can't do the work. You can do the work under the guidelines of education, if not testifying on a particular bill, but you can't support a candidate. That's kind of your primary restriction, is that you can't support individual candidates.
Michael, do you want to add to this piece around policy, and then we'll go to some of the questions.
Thirdly, one of the things I think that has been good about the troubles and the challenges that we faced in these recent years, among so many tragedies that have kind of awakened people, is that it has been good for our democracy. It's been good for our democracy here in Georgia. If you look at it, as we turn toward more, kind of flip this old prejudice notion that every poor person needs to lift themselves up by their bootstraps. If you invert that and say every disadvantaged person or every person that is subject to be treated in a disadvantaged fashion, either because of their gender, their color, where they come from, their income, that every person is an activist. Every person now, because of the technology that we've talked about, because of the way that through the palm of our hand via our phones have access to the rest of the world, that we can all be activists, that we can all be greater participants. I mean, one of the lessons from Georgia is that you saw a tremendous exercise in democracy, where people used their power, the one power that was guaranteed to them by the Constitution, the right to vote, and they put it to good use. People who had been asleep really for almost 15, 20 years. The numbers have been there in Georgia to turn Georgia blue for at least 15 years. But you had to have the aggravation, the annoyance of oppression on people to say no more. And not just affecting all the nonprofits that are involved, NAACP, ACLU, all the folks, Fair Fight Georgia, they were woke and alert, but it was out in the masses where people finally found that they had a tool and a weapon that was guaranteed to them that they could use to make real change. And that change happened in Georgia. And so the reaction that you see underneath the gold dome here with 40 bills to try to restrict that power, to limit that voice, is a knee-jerk reaction, again, trying to force people who are non-white, non-majority, back into a corner, back into quote unquote your place. But you don't have to go back to your place. Everyone can be an activist. Everyone can support these nonprofits who are doing this good work. You can do it through your contributions. You can do it through your volunteerism. But you can also, no one has an excuse anymore not to be involved. When I was growing up, following my dad around when he was in the House and the Senate, there seemed to be a feeling that you could wind your legislator up or your mayor or whomever, and you wouldn't see him again until election time. Well, it's time out for that. You can monitor your elected officials. You can monitor what goes on at every level of government, right there at the end of your arm, in your hand. And you can comment, you can email, more importantly, you can call or and write a letter. Call them directly and leave a message or get them on the phone and give them a piece of your mind. My father used to say that being elected was a license to get cussed out, and he wasn't wrong. But guess what? They deserve that cussing out. They deserve to hear a piece of your mind. They need to hear, because if they hear from you, then those who are pulling on their coattails or bending their ear for something that is not honorable or not beneficial to the greater community, or that furthers our goal, their voice becomes louder. They need to hear from you at every corner. I get it everywhere, at the grocery store, gas station, barbershop, and I deserve to get it, and so we need to make sure that people, that there's also a furtherance of individual power and the options that they have to use that power. So it's most important to use it at the voting booth, but we need to use it through the vehicle of these different organizations who are looking out for these different issues that affect us. Whether it's issues around women, issues around gender, around poverty, there is a place for you to exercise and to be active. Every person is an activist, and that's what we need to push for people.
Well, if we were all together in a big conference room, I would ask everyone to give you a round of applause. They can't do that, but I'll pause for that because that was such a great conversation that we'll continue with the folks in the chat. So what I'm going to do is, and we don't have a lot of time. There's already a lot of questions. I'm not going to be able to get to them all, but so I'm going to pick a few out of here. But the first one I want to ask you about is one that I get a lot as a nonprofit leader, as a Black nonprofit leader. And I'm going to ask it, but then I'm going to ask it a little differently, because I think it is important to do a little, I think there's a little more depth to it than what's here. It asks, what is the role of white allies in an organization that is working on advancing equity? But I'm going to ask it a little differently. I'm going to ask, what is the importance of Black leadership in an organization, and what is the relationship then to white allyship to Black leadership within an organization trying to advance racial equity? So that's my little caveat on that question. Anyone can answer.
I'll jump in, and also want to not overlook one of the things Lauren said is about vendors. So when you're checking your equity portfolio, are you buying services and products from Black-owned businesses? So in Atlanta, that is, that's something that's been, of course, an important part of how we have grown and prospered as a community. But it is very easy to get into hiring the consultants, not thinking your printer matters, doesn't matter who, you can be very intentional. And because in Atlanta, we talk about the book, the ballot, and the buck. You get educated, you vote, and you build economic power. And that's a virtuous cycle. So one of the things is to say also, in terms of, as an African-American leader, one of the things that, we need white allies to do is believe us when we say there is a racial dimension to what is happening, right? I don't want to, it's like, no more, are you sure? The questions are a microaggression, because if a Black leader, if someone who has grown to a level of authority is willing to step out there and name something as racial, they have thought about it 9 ways to Sunday. And so when it comes out of their mouth, you can take it to the bank. Do not question it. Do not say you must have misunderstood. Believe it. And then let's talk about what you do in response to it. I think there is and so I think that's one of the most important things, whether especially if you're a board member, respecting the authority, making sure that you are abiding by the role of a board member, respecting the role of the executive director, within the organization, making sure you are not doing things that undermine Black leadership, being overly familiar. I am now like an old Black woman. I am the age, my daughter is now the age my dad was when he was in the civil rights movement. And so when your staff, when your direct reports are not respectful of you around other people in whatever context, it is undermining. So one of the things is to be very conscious of microaggressions, be very conscious of undermining the authority of African American leaders, and then is believe them when they tell you that something has a racial dimension. Those would be two things I would say.
I build on that a little bit. I'm the first woman of color to lead the Women's Foundation, first Black woman. I'm the only person in the state of Colorado to have led a family foundation, a private foundation, now a community foundation, and used to be senior at another. So I am literally the oldest, longest standing person in philanthropy in the state. And I'm willing to say the oldest. But one of the things that I think I have faced throughout my career is the question of, but how do we know you can run the business? Okay. People like to say, wow, that sounds really good. Or, you're so articulate, or I love the way you tell stories to capture the, the mission and the themes, but can you run the business? So there is a burden for us to run the business, and to draw upon every contact, every resource, every webinar, whatever it may be, to ensure from financial management, investment management, legal management, public policy management, communications, that you know what you're talking about. Does that continue the old adage that we have to be better? For those of us who are breaking through those barriers of being in leadership positions, I'm embarrassed to say at some level it does. And the reality is that we can. I am not an exception, not by any means. There are hundreds of thousands of Andrea Youngs, of Michael Julian Bonds, of Lauren Young Casteels throughout this country, just as there are Amanda Gormans or any of those that we lift up as some exception. But what has to happen from our allies is to share the power, is to recognize the fear that exists in actually sharing the power. My father wrote in his book, Beyond Racism, that means that America must share with Black people the power and the privileges now held only by white Americans. They cannot ask the Black man to be responsible, or woman, without giving him or her the responsibility for his or her own destiny. It cannot ask him to exercise discipline unless it allows him or her the power to control their own lives. And so allyship is not just about holding hands and walking the walk through the march. It's about speaking up when there is injustice. It's about sharing the power and the opportunity and stepping aside when necessary in order for that voice that is legitimate and authentic to speak for itself. It's about paying us well in the nonprofit sector. We are undervalued. Those organizations that are led by people of color are undervalued, underinvested in, underrecognized. There was a movement some years ago to ask foundations, how many organizations led by people of color do you fund? And people got really anxious about it. Those questions are coming back around. But again, it can't be short term. It can't be, we did a statement, we put out $90 million this year. Well, what's going to happen 5 years from now, 12 years from now? We are not going to make up this history of lack of support that has existed, or the intentional undermining of communities, poor communities, communities of color, without long-term substantial investment in those communities. It's about being willing to open Black banks. It's about all of the above to build the infrastructure. My dad used to say, Black power is green power, Lauren. Black power is green power. And at the time, I'll be honest, I wanted him to be a little bit more radical. I wanted some of that. But if he were here today, that still remains true. Education, jobs, but it's the infrastructure of our communities as well, just as it is the infrastructure of our organizations, in order to build a sustainable future for my children and my grandchildren as well.
And I'll just jump in just for half a second. I kind of deal with this in a micro kind of way on dealing with my political colleagues who are white, and dealing with folks here in and around Atlanta. You have, if you're going to build toward a goal that's going to benefit everyone, in this instance, it's the elimination of racism, it's the elimination of oppression. You have to accept people on the same level. You have to treat people open and in an open fashion, and accept their experiences as valid as your own. When you have that interaction with individuals, it's not enough sometimes to just to have a minority in the room. You need to make sure that along with having that person there who represents whatever group it is, that their experience is accepted in an authentic way, which is something that, as a minority in this country, when I deal with my friends and colleagues who are of the majority population, accepting their experience is automatic. It's like breathing air. But I'm constantly having to educate, even if it's in anecdotes or in centimeters, about the experiences that I have had as an African American male, growing up here in Atlanta, even in a majority African American supposed city. And so you need to make sure it is in these individual moments that I think that we conquer our issues. And we need our friends who are of the majority population, who are in positions to be our defenders when we're not around, to carry the ball when I'm not in the room, or when there's not a woman in the room, or there's not a minority in the room, but to carry that banner, to say, to validate and educate others, because it's only with that broad education, this broader learning about the impacts of racism on us, and how it affects us, and how it affects our country in America. It's got to be carried in the rooms where we're not present, at the dinner tables, in the club meetings, in the conversations on the golf courses, or wherever it is that conversation is being had. That racism, intolerance, oppression is not it just isn't tolerated, and that people are equal based on the efforts and the education that they've had, the way that they've come up, and everyone's experience in this country is valid, and we need to make sure that we're accepting that with people.
The reality is, I said earlier, a new emerging majority is that by 2050, the Black people, brown people, people of color will be the majority. So it is good business for everybody for us to invest in the advancement of economic opportunities, educational opportunities, housing access, that we can begin to close the income gaps, the multi-generational wealth gaps. It is in the best interest of everyone of this country and of its democracy that we are fully engaged as voters, as bankers, as business folks, all of the above, because the demographics are changing, and it creates an undercurrent of anxiety within the country. We're seeing that now. That I think that's a part of the angst that is rippling up the river beneath the river that is burgeoning up at this time. But the train is on the track. That will happen.
Yeah, I think that, just to echo what Lauren is saying, I mean, the choice is very, very clear. There either people are committed to a multiracial, multicultural democracy, or there's going to be something else based on white supremacy. and the white supremacist regime will not be a democracy. And so there's a lot of conversation that needs to happen within the Black community. You know, women, we talk to one another as women. You know, Black people, we talk and strategize. I mean, you know, we need white people to really take seriously the challenge to white supremacy and the extent to which they are really committed to overturning, you know, a regime and a society that is based on perpetuating white supremacy. And I think, you know, the choice was very, very clear. And people don't need to fool themselves about that. And, you know, the other thing white supremacist white supremacist rule will bring is more incidents like what happened in Texas, more fires in California. I mean, we're not going to deal with climate change. We're not going to deal with, you know, the next pandemic unless we really wrestle with this idea of, you know, we are going to be and affirm that America is a multiracial democracy built on principles of equity and working to make sure that we have a society that works for every single person in our community.
Because that's what equity means. And people forget that. And people assume that you need to use the same tools, responses, tactics, engagements with all people at the same time. But if we are invested in equity, that means that no one's future is determined on the basis of gender, race, sexual orientation, ability, any of those things, that those are not determinants. And currently, they are social determinants of health, of wealth, and well-being. And that has to change.
Yeah, my father used to often tell me, if you do not address your problems and solve them, they'll unfortunately be solved for you. And I think that that's the position that America is in. You know, if particularly the majority of the population, if we continue to excuse what is abhorrent and in the majority population and in the white population, like I said, you know, the myth of white privilege that caused an insurrection in our capital. You know, this, and to me, it goes all the way back to the post-Civil War during the Grant administration when he was president of the United States. He came down hard on the South. He was intolerant of white supremacists and subversive efforts. You know, they passed the anti-Ku Klux Klan law. They persecuted persons who were harming minority communities throughout the South. And when those who were at the head of that movement ceased, that's when we saw the rise of Jim Crow. That's when we saw, and they not only ceased being an enforcement and helping to lift up and protect minorities, they turned a blind eye for almost 100 years until we got the movement in the height of the movement in the 1960s. So the movement was ongoing, and so if we need those who are in the majority community, who are people of good faith, who believe in true democracy, who believe in diversity, to make their voices heard in all quarters and corners, and to work towards a brighter future in America. Because I believe it was Abraham Lincoln, Laura, that when they were having those Lincoln-Douglas debates, they said that America would either be all slave or all free. So it's either going to be all democracy, or we're going to get what we just got rid of again. And I don't want to go back. And I don't think anyone on this call should go back. I had the pleasure of working for nonprofits, the YMCA and the NAACP, sometimes at the same time, and I loved it. You know, but these are the organizations that have the hearts of the community that are in line with particular facets of issues that we need to have addressed, and we need to do it openly with our eyes wide open, and we need to make sure that we are being the standard bearers for the rest of our greater communities, because each one of these, each nonprofit obviously has its particular mission, but the ultimate mission is the welfare of everyone, the welfare of the community where you're operating. And so to do that and be honest about it, you've got to have the ideal that we're going to be about equity, that we're going to be about fairness, that we're going to be about love, and we're going to be honest with each other as we try to improve the community, because the community is not good for you if the community is not good for me.
Right. So we're gonna have to end there. I'm gonna pass it back to Nisha. Thank you all. But I'm gonna summarize something that you all said to that last question that I think is a lesson that everyone can bring home. And that if they want to know how can I advance racial equity, how can I advance that policy, I'd say find Black leaders, trust them, believe them, and follow them, and you will likely be on that path that you look to be on.